Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Saliba, representing the board of Freeport Speech, and welcome to our third event of the 2025 season. I'm not going to take much time at all to repeat our thank yous and our announcements because they were up on the screen. They're in your program, and I hope you'll take your programs home if you haven't had a chance to look at them already and read it then. Specifically, take a quick look at the link for tickets to our next event about Ukraine. They're already on sale. They're going fast. It's a smaller venue up at Kresge Auditorium at Bowdoin College. So if you want to go, I would not delay. Our important conversation tonight is between two leaders who, through Freeport Speech, have become dear friends of mine. So let me tell you something about each of them that you may not know. Dr. Ross Greene, the internationally renowned child psychologist, has been featured on the Oprah Winfrey Show, Good Morning America, The Today Show. I could go on and on. Rita and I were out to dinner with Ross and his wife Jenny recently when a couple at a nearby table interrupted us. "Excuse me," the wife said, addressing Ross. She said, "Are you Dr. Ross Greene? I think I recognize you from a picture on the cover of one of your books." "Yes, I am," responded Ross. "I just wanted to thank you for saving our son's life," said the woman. Evidently, this happens often when you're out with Ross. He was speaking in Hong Kong last week and just arrived back in Maine yesterday to be here for our event. Ross also likes home-fried potatoes at breakfast. Dr. Greene may be the internationally famous child psychologist, but during COVID, Dr. Nirav Shah proved to be all of our adult psychiatrist. He, more than anyone else, was the leader whose daily sessions got us through COVID, got us through the pandemic. What you may not know about is that Nirav and his wife Kara have just adopted a 3-year-old, 105-pound German Shepherd, Fritz, who is challenging the limits of Nirav's physical stamina. 20-hour days during COVID and at the CDC were a piece of cake by comparison with keeping up with Fritz. Nirav is known for his Diet Cokes, but also likes a good cold beer, a glass of wine, and makes an incredible pizza. Please join me and the Freeport Speech Board in welcoming our friends, Dr. Ross Greene and Dr. Nirav Shah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Tom. Oh. Very good. Thanks, Tom. All right. How is everyone doing tonight? Great. Thank you all for coming. It is great to see everybody. Oh, well, yeah, it might be one of those kinds of evenings. It is great to see everybody. Thank you all for coming out tonight. And let me just say this at the top. It is great to be home for good. Ross Greene, welcome to Freeport Speech.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let's dive right in.
Yep.
So tonight we're going to do a few things. We are obviously going to talk about the key question, which is, are the kids okay? And we're going to do so in 3 segments or modules. The first will be this thesis question of whether or not the kids are okay. We're then going to do an antithesis section to examine some of the differing viewpoints on that. And then we're going to have a synthesis of all of this to figure out what it means. What I'd like to do this evening is to punctuate the session with questions as we go along. And so at the end of each of those, after the thesis, after the antithesis, and certainly after the synthesis, We're going to break for 1 or 2 questions. I ask that you try to keep the question focused on what we've just discussed so that we have ideas for further exploration. And make no mistake, we're going to have plenty of time at the end, at least a solid half hour, to wrap it all up and take questions on all of it. But Ross, let's dive into the thesis question. Are the kids okay?
Surprisingly, most are. Not surprisingly, many are not. And more than ever are not. Which means that although many are still doing quite well, we have really good reason to look at reasons that those who are not doing well are not, because there's more of them than ever.
As you and I have been discussing this topic, one theme that comes out is that it's difficult to separate the mental health of children from the mental health of adults. What do we know about that nexus between children's mental health and adult mental health?
We know that the people kids are going home to are struggling these days as well. We're seeing elevated rates of anxiety and depression in kids. We are seeing elevated rates of anxiety and depression in adults. And many are probably being affected by the same things. I don't know that it helps us a great deal to differentiate between adults and kids, especially on many of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight.
Well, we're going to dive into a lot of these causative factors in a lot more detail, social media, phones, all of it. But at a high level, as you said a second ago, there are a lot of stressors that have emerged in recent history, certainly the past few years, but even stretching back a past few decades.
Yep.
Detail some of those stressors. What are the more salient ones in your mind? And what are the ways in which those stressors impact children's mental health?
Well, let me start with that last part. I think of anxiety and depression as stress responses. They are human responses to stress. Frustration responses are a response to stress as well. Concerning behaviors, which has been my gig for 4 decades, is a response to stress, right? So the million-dollar question, just paraphrasing what you just asked, is what's been stressful? I have my list just so I don't forget anything.
Great.
I don't usually bring a list, but it is an impressive list of stressors that have kicked in since in the range of 2010. What's interesting for later discussion is that, yes, social media and cell phone use kicked in around the same time, but so did a whole bunch of other things. Here we go. This is my treatise on how life is much harder for kids than it's ever been. You ready?
It's 4 or 5 pages long, so buckle in.
No, these are in case anybody wants actual data. In the 1980s, we began being more flexible about gender roles. The traditional role of women and the traditional roles of men began to be in flux a little bit. That's interesting, because if your role is not narrowly defined, you've got some self-exploring to do, because the roles are not clearly defined for you. A big one, 1999, Columbine, the first of over 200. The first of over 200. When I'm talking with kids, and they're telling me what they're stressed about, perhaps the number one response, and this is not scientific, this is anecdotal, is they're afraid of getting shot at school. Some of them are even kind of angry that somehow us adults haven't been able to do anything about that. 200 and some odd shootings later, including Sandy Hook, which was 13 years later. This is a big one. I know that we have a lot of educators in the room as well. High-stakes testing became a big deal in the late 90s. This will probably be the most edgy thing I say all night, but I think educators will relate to this. High-stakes testing caused many educators to feel like they were being transformed into test prep robots. And that was not good for kids, because educators have always been among the most important socialization agents in our society. But it explains why many educators have said to me, they've taken all the humanity out of my job. And that's been true for a very long time. By the way, that hasn't been good for educator mental health either. Talking about the ecosystem that kids are existing in. 2010, this is an interesting one if we wanted to be provocative.
And we do.
Do we?
Yes.
Should I ramp it up a little?
Yeah. You're at a 7. Let's take it to a 9.
This will get us to 9.
Good.
In 2000, and if you're an educator, don't take this the wrong way, but around 2010, self-care programs started becoming very popularized in the form often of, well, these words are banned in many school systems now, the words I'm about to say, social and emotional learning. That's actually become more of a political hot potato. But what it did was it had kids looking inward, which is a good thing. But I don't know if I think about Ross Greene, circa 1960s, in my youth, I won't be specific about the year, I wasn't doing a whole lot of introspection. That's an interesting one, because as you do more introspection, you might find some things that aren't so happy going on in there. All right, just a few more. This is the provocative one. Religion started to decline in influence and popularity starting around 2010. And religion was a guidepost for many people. Religion was their community. Religion was their hope. Religion was their values. Interesting one. And then just 2 more. Around 2010, we started becoming much more politically polarized. Isn't this interesting? All of these happening around the same time. This is the ecosystem in which kids exist, right? And I have seen that polarization referred to now as the most intense since the Civil War. There's the ecosystem in which kids are existing, one that is ultra, mega polarized. And then finally, also around 2010, kids, especially in the United States, but also other places, began expressing more fluid ideas about their sexuality. The roles there were not so linear anymore. That's going to make you think about who you are and what your preferences are, and perhaps earlier than a lot of us did in a different era. So I think about Ross Greene happily riding his bike to school in the morning, North Miami Elementary School. Yes, I appreciate that. You're probably wondering, how did I end up here? I wouldn't live anywhere else, and certainly not Miami, Florida, but it was great then. Now I wouldn't live there. Happily riding his bike to school, really not having much to think about except being a safety patrol and making sure that kids got across the street, and would I be promoted to lieutenant.
Yeah.
This is quite the list, I think, that tells us about the ecosystem kids have been living in for a very long time. That's stress. Anxiety is a stress response. Depression is a stress response. Acting out is a frustration response. Here's looking at you, kids, and yet most are doing well. That's why I said surprisingly.
I want to press on that, because notwithstanding those factors, that litany of social changes, your view is still that the kids are generally okay, even though perhaps a slightly larger fraction are not okay. That, I think, as you and I have gotten to know each other, that to me was initially a contrarian view. We're gonna grapple with some of those contrarian views in a second, but leaving that aside for a moment, how is it that even though there's been this upswing of challenges, to say nothing, and we haven't even dived into social media and cell phones, which also came out around that 2010 period. Given all of this upheaval, how is it that the kids are still okay?
How is it that most kids are still doing okay?
Yes.
I do think that most kids many kids who are in the category of those who are doing okay, do have low-lying levels of anxiety and loneliness. Once again, anxiety and depression are part of the human condition. I don't think we have a great idea of what the protective factors are. They are the usual suspects. Some have to do with family, some have to do with school, as we've heard quite a bit about, some have to do with relationships. Generally speaking, the kids who were doing well are still doing well. The kids who are at risk are the kids who tend to be vulnerable in some way in the first place.
Ross, a key feature of a lot of your work is identifying those vulnerable kids and offering them tools in conjunction with the child rather than a top-down approach. We're going to dive into all of that, but just as a teaser for folks, how should we think about the risk factors that make kids more vulnerable and the markers that parents should be looking for to think about vulnerable children?
Here we are moving a bit away from fact. I like to be very clear. There's a lot of information out there. Not only is this a tough time to be a kid, it's a tough time to be a parent. Just the amount of information that is available, should you dare get online to look up anything, and most of it's contradictory, but a very big proportion of it is not factual, not based in data, right? So I'm straying a little here. I don't like to do this because I'd rather stick with the data, but on this, the data are a bit equivocal. So kids who are already prone to depression, kids who are already prone to anxiety, kids who are already prone to concerning behavior. And yes, there are risk factors for concerning behavior, most of them involving skills, not poor parenting, not poor motivation, skills like flexibility, adaptability, frustration tolerance, problem solving, emotion regulation. That's my sweet spot, right? Neurodivergent kids have had one heck of a time of it.
Yes.
Kids with disabilities are those who get punitive exclusionary discipline at school greatly out of proportion to their numbers. That applies to kids with black and brown skin as well. So we are now moving, some of that is data-based and some of that is more anecdotal, but those are the usual risk factors. And I don't think the risk factors have changed all that much.
But the ecosystem has, and I want to recap one of your theses here, which is there have always been changes. There have been more changes since around the 2010 mark. Some of them have been political, some of them have been identitarian, some of them have been technological, cell phones, social media. We're going to come back to those. And it is difficult to disaggregate the causative force of each of those. That said, there have been attempts made at doing so. So again, we're going to come back to the substance, but just as a methodology point, walk us through how psychologists think about what causes what.
A good study is longitudinal. On the plane back from San Francisco yesterday, there was this just delightful, easy temperament infant.
Oh, I thought you were going to say 105-pound German Shepherd, because I was about to get really optimistic for a second.
It was not your dog.
Okay, because that dog...
Across the aisle.
Yeah, okay.
There's hope, though.
There's hope.
Yeah. You
That
only
dog
had
is
to-
like an hour and a half away from Kool-Aid Manning through one of the walls in our house. So we'll see how this goes. But sorry, you were talking about an infant.
Beautiful, easy kid, right? That's where the study would begin, right? The study begins there. The study actually the ideal study would be done before the kid was born.
Mom, yeah.
To get stressors, parental attitudes. Then as you see what happens to this kid as time goes on, you've got yourself a nice longitudinal study. That study has not been done on social media. That study has not been done on phones, right? So when we're talking about disaggregating, especially if we're talking about those things, we have to disaggregate, separate, see the unique contribution, as we might call it statistically, of all the things I just talked about, paired up against social media and cell phones. That study has not been done, probably will never be done. So in research, we're looking for main effects. Does this cause that? In mental health, there aren't that many main effects. There just aren't. Mental health is not that way. And us mental health professionals are used to it. It's more provocative. It sells more books. It gets you on TV if you are more provocative, if you are saying something that's main effecty, but that doesn't mean it's true. So when I'm reading a lot of the studies, I'm looking for words like cause. You can't say cause unless you've really got a longitudinal study or an experimental design. And a lot of the studies are correlational in nature. And one of the first things I was taught in grad school is correlation does not equal causation, right? So if you see the words linked, correlation, associated with, correlation, correlated with, correlation. And here's what's interesting. If it's correlation, then the effects can be bidirectional, and that is critical, right? We're always looking for unidirectional. This causes that. In mental health, good luck. We still don't know what causes ADHD. We don't know what causes autism. We've got theories. We do not have anything that's definitive. We don't have much definitive in mental health, in kids in particular, right? When there's a lot going on, it's very hard to say, this caused that. So I tend to think of cumulative stress. But let me go back to the bidirectional thing. Bidirectional means that it could go in either direction, and that's what correlation is. It could, just because they're correlated with each other doesn't mean this causes that. This could cause that.
Or they could.
Or what we might call a transactional model, right? And so what's interesting is there's research to show that, for example, kids who are more depressed or more anxious or more alienated from school or doing less well in school are more attracted to social media and more likely to participate excessively in social media. That's what we would call bidirectionality. So whenever I see cause in mental health, I look more closely. And that's the key. Look more closely. Cause is hard to come by in mental health. And as you and I were just talking about backstage, even medicine is not completely hard, rock solid. And as I said, otherwise Reggie Lewis would still be alive.
Right.
So even in medicine, things aren't always rock solid.
That's very helpful, and we're gonna come back. That's one parallel between the fields of psychology and public health and epidemiology. This difficulty in ferreting out causation. Another one that I want to touch on, and perhaps we'll come back to in the last section when we talk a bit more about what it all means, is something you already alluded to in passing, which is confirmation bias.
Yes.
It's exceedingly easy to find support for whatever theory you've got out there.
Yeah.
For example, let's say you believe that adopting a 3.5-year-old German Shepherd is a great idea.
Do you have something on your mind tonight?
There are scores of people
I'm a psychologist.
who will
Maybe I
cheer
can
you
help.
on in that venture. But that affects the way that a lot of folks are seeking information about the challenges that kids are facing right now. How are you seeing confirmation bias come up in the literature, in your practice, in the kids or the parents that you talk about?
You know, even in mental health, everybody's got an angle. And if you've got an angle, you can find support for your angle. And if you've got an angle, you are less likely, and this is the confirmation bias part, you are more likely to pay attention to the research and the data that confirms your point of view, and less likely to pay attention to the research and the data that would disconfirm your point of view, or, and this is the key word, make it more nuanced. These things are so full of nuance. That's why it's hard to make a causal statement. That's why it's so hard to parse out all of these things that are different for kids, especially when we're thinking that there is causality in things like social media.
Last question before we break for a few questions. So if you've got one or two things that you want to weigh in on about this part of the conversation, please be ready to chime in. Ross, when you were walking through some of the factors that have changed, you started around the 80s. But I wonder if you could take us back even further than that. There have been these changes, technological and social, that have seemingly always happened, and sometimes they have been associated with some degree of moral panic. Whether it's TV, radio, Elvis, whatever it may be. Walk us through historically how some of these things have been viewed in the psychology community, and whether or to what extent that informs your view of these things that we're seeing today.
Well, you know, the Beatles caused quite a stir. Raise your hand if you listen to the Beatles. Raise your hand if you think you turned out just fine. Fascinating. Well, you might be right. I've sometimes referred to the social media thing, and not, by the way, I take it seriously. The nice thing is I don't really have skin in the social media game. What I have skin in the game of is do right by kids, do what's best by kids, right? I don't have stock in whether it's social media or not. If it's something that's bad for kids, I'm interested. The things I named were bad for kids, right? But the theory was that the Beatles were bad for kids. We saw Elvis's gyrating was bad for kids.
Very bad.
Very bad. Maybe the worst.
Probably the worst.
Probably.
Worse than Facebook.
Right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you all probably remember this, but 20, 30 years ago, marijuana was being referred to as a gateway drug. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on that one, especially as it relates to current usage. But marijuana has now been monetized. So I've been around long enough to be skeptical. But in mental health, we used to refer to refrigerator parents. Anybody remember this? Refrigerator parents as the cause of autism. There were theories about family dynamics as the cause of schizophrenia, right? We used to refer to kids who had difficulty reading 30, 40 years ago as lazy and dumb. Luckily, we've made some progress in some of those realms, but my skepticism is not only born of my scientific breeding, but also of experience, right? And, you know, we should also mention, no matter what it is, the capitalists are going to be involved. I think we live in a capitalistic society. There is money to be made on kids, right? That's always been true. I used to be cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I assume many of you were too. I used to think that Frosted Flakes were great. So they sold me, but now that I'm older, I'm skeptical both of what money sometimes leads us to do, and of research findings that people have an agenda and may have a confirmation bias issue.
Great. We're going to come back and dive into all of that. But let's take a quick break and grab one or two questions from folks in the audience. We're going to turn the house lights up, And I am going to call, we'll take one question from this side of the room and then another question from that side of the room. So, yes, sir, right here. And we've got a mic coming so that the folks online can also get the benefit of it.
First of all, I'm a huge fan of yours, Dr. Shah. I used to listen to you all the time, trapped at home with 5 kids, not too far from here.
Thank you.
And Dr. Green, I don't know you very well, but so far, really impressed.
I just want to make sure you know that Dr. Shah has a new dog.
Yes, I got it.
It's been on my mind just a little bit.
So this is kind of a big question. You mentioned, I forgot the number 5, 10 stressors. So with 5 kids, so now, post-COVID, AI, environmental crisis, global instability, Gaza, Ukraine,
Yeah.
and a worse polarized political situation than we've ever seen, and certainly since the Civil War, as well as mental health crisis and all the rest of it. I'm sure I'm leaving out. What do you say about this cacophony of immense stressors?
I'm going to just repeat the question, really, or précise of the question, which is, in addition to some of the factors that Dr. Green mentioned, there are additional things that have transpired just in the past 2 or 3 years. War, climate change, instability that's been brought from every precinct and quarter. Ross, are those, I'll paraphrase the gentleman's question. Are those differences of degree or are they differences of kind for your analysis?
I think they are differences of proximity.
Okay.
I think the more proximal you are to a stressor and the more personal it is to you, the more you're going to feel it. Best example I can give of that is I used to be flight anxious. I wasn't flight anxious when I was not on the airplane. I was flight anxious when I was on the airplane. My anxiety would give rise to some very interesting but irrational thinking that would only make my anxiety worse. Fortunately, that passed just because of the sheer number of airplanes I've been on, right? But yes, I was that guy on the flight to Albuquerque, New Mexico, who was sitting on the window where I had to sit, scanning the skies for other airplanes. And I saw one. And I called the flight attendant over. And I said, "Do you think the pilot knows that plane's over there?" And she looked at me like I was out of my mind and said, "I'll go find out." About a minute later, the pilot got on the intercom and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I do know that that plane is over there." I was thinking about wings falling off. I was thinking about every possible calamity that could befall an airplane, especially if it was on an airplane, right? If Russia, Ukraine is not proximal to you or personal to you, there's a decent chance it is going to affect you less in the anxiety department.
Very helpful. Let's grab one more question over here. Yes, ma'am. Right here in the second to last row.
Thank you. So I thought what you said about, I think kids in particular just being more inward facing and just thinking about this more was fascinating, but I want to hear what you think about how that's also translating into medication, right? So I think there's something, the more, I don't want to say mainstream, but the more familiar kids are about medication, seeing more peers medicated, how do you see that? Is that a stressor? Or do you think that has an impact on how they see themselves?
Kids know more about meds than they ever have, that's for sure. And meds for psychotropic purposes are more popular in this country than any other. That's part of the ecosystem in which kids exist as well. I don't know if meds add stress. I haven't thought of medication as an additional stressor, but I do think that the more you look inward, which is not a bad thing, by the way, but I think the more you look inward, the more you're going to find.
Very good. Thank you all. Ross, we're gonna move to the antithesis section, which I'm gonna just sort of broadly label as the anxious generation, question mark. Because there is another view out there, a view that stipulates or suggests that right now this generation is the anxious generation and that there is a great rewiring of childhood that is underway. How should we square your sanguine assessment of where kids are and how they're doing with that alternative view of the world? What do you make of that assessment that the kids right now constitute the anxious generation?
More kids are anxious. Most kids are not paralyzingly anxious. If we're going to make the stance that social media, as we're referencing this anxious generation, I'm not sure the anxious generation is the best title for that book as it relates to what it's really about, right? But that doesn't matter. The dialed-in generation, the digital generation, because that's really the main point that Jonathan Haidt, the author of The Anxious Generation, is focused on. He has other things that he focuses on, like the need for kids to have less parental oversight of their play. But there's less data to support that part anyways, right? And that's not the main part of his stance, largely. The main part of his stance is that social media caused this generation to be anxious. And as we were talking about earlier, that's a very provocative stance to take, and I worry about social media too, so I'm not saying he doesn't have a point. I'm saying that it is impossible that the data are not as strong as to be able to make a statement like that, right? Most of the data are mixed. You've got just as much data showing that's not true as showing that it is true. Most of the data showing that it is true are correlational in nature. What's our expression for the night? Correlation does not equal causation. But mostly, given all of these things that coincided with social media and phones becoming popularized, we cannot make definitive statements, in my view, about what's causing what and what accounts for most of the variance in kids' anxiety and depression. So it's not that he's not making a good point. And once again, I have no skin in this game. I don't. It is what it is. I just don't think we can say anything about social media or phones with that level of precision.
That's helpful. And just for avoidance of doubt, your position is not that social media is a uniformly good thing or that it is unambiguously bad. Your point, I think, is that it can amplify concerns that are already pre-existing, and that in a healthy ecosystem, it may have beneficial effects, but in an unhealthy ecosystem, it can magnify those things. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah,
assessment?
but I don't even think it's that precise. I think that there are kids who are in unhealthy ecosystems who benefit from being in social media because they are in marginalized populations and are finding support in social media. So I'm not even sure that it's that definitive, right? It is, what I would say is, it's highly individualized. And anytime we're making aggregate statements about all kids, kids are not a monolith. Adults are not a monolith. This is highly individualized, and it depends on things like characteristics of the kid, which we've already talked about. But there's others to talk about, especially as it relates to girls on social media. Support systems, amount of time spent, what that time is being spent doing in social media. This is highly individualized. The more individualized it becomes, the less able we are to make definitive statement about effects.
I want to push you on that, partly from a methodology perspective, but also just from a practical advice perspective that you would give. Given that these causal relationships are very difficult to ascertain, as you discussed, and all the data are not yet in and may not be in for quite some time, why not adopt a precautionary stance? Why not say, for young girls, social media can be particularly pernicious. For young boys who are exposed to toxic masculinity, it can be particularly harmful. Why not restrict its use until all the data are in? Why not take a more precautionary stance?
You can. The question is really, do you take a legislative precautionary stance? Do you take a policy precautionary stance? That starts to bump up against some other things that we treasure in this country. Like so many things, this comes down to the individual judgment of parents and their reading of the data and the expectations they're going to have with their kids, not only around social media, but around so many other things. Ultimately, as it relates to one's household, it comes down to parental expectations and juxtaposed against whether a kid can actually meet those expectations.
I'm going to bring up a related topic, but then we can talk more broadly about your advice around both of these, which is cell phones, particularly cell phones in schools. This has been a big topic nationwide. It's been a big topic here in Maine. For folks' awareness, the Maine legislature today advanced legislation that would require schools and school districts to have a plan for how to manage cell phone use within schools, particularly during school hours. This has again been, there's been a variance of policy responses. Some states like Florida have enacted statewide bell-to-bell bans. Others like Maine are taking a somewhat more middle approach. How should we think about this issue of cell phone use in schools? Let's break it down. Is cell phone use in schools a problem?
Yes.
Okay, that was really easy. So what should be the proper response given from your view and from your approach as a psychologist? How should we think about this issue?
My approach as a psychologist is to involve kids in the solution. People have been frustrated by the fact that Maine is a local control state. I've dealt with the local control issue in Maine back when Steve Bowen was the Commissioner of Education. And I was meeting with him as part of the Juvenile Justice Advisory Group in the state. And he was invited to speak. And he said, the first thing I want you all to know is that as Commissioner of Education, I have no power. He said, I can't do anything. He said, I can suggest, I can recommend, I can't do anything because of local control, right? So, number one, I'm not sure that there's much choice from the perspective of the Commissioner of Education, right? The Commissioner of Education, Pender has to deal with local control, right? She can recommend, she can guide, she can make resources available. She can't tell them what to do. Legislators can tell people what to do, right? And this is just my way of working with kids and families and schools for 4 decades, I'm skeptical of approaches where we are mandating things. You can speak better than me about how successful we were at mandating things during COVID. I actually think, maybe you agree, you and I have not talked about this, that an approach that was less mandatory oriented and more community oriented, do right by your neighbor, take care of each other, might have been a lot more successful, right? So I'm skeptical of mandates. I am especially skeptical when we adults believe that we can control kids and their outcomes. That's delusional.
So as it relates to cell phones particularly, you and I have talked about examples where the approach that you espouse has been employed. Talk to us about those. What do they tell us, and what is the promise of that sort of cooperative approach?
For me, why would you leave the kids out of the loop on something that affects their lives? And why would you leave the kids out of the loop on something that if you mandate it, this is kids, right? They're going to find a way around it. So there's also a practicality issue here. There's an enforcement issue here. It's nice to get all loaded up for bear thinking that we can control these things, but I find that the more loaded up we get for bear, the more disappointing the outcomes tend to be. So great that each school system has to come up with a plan. I think that's fantastic. And I encourage each school system as they're coming up with a plan to engage the kids in assisting with that plan to the greatest degree possible, because not just with kids, but throughout human history, imposition of will doesn't tend to go very well. A more collaborative approach tends to go a whole lot better. And truth is, there have been, you and I both listened to this piece that was on NPR a few weeks ago, where some kids in Minnesota at a school were engaged in the process of reducing cell phone use and educating their peers about the dangers of social media and cell phone use. And that sounded much more right to me than a mandate that is adults trying to control things that I don't know if we can control. Just as the worst case scenario, by the way. Imagine this, a kid who is very dependent on social media for one reason or another, right? Deciding they're not going to school because they'd rather stay home and be on social media. That exists now. I don't see how the mandate takes care of that, right? We still have work to do, even if we're mandating.
Very interesting. But there's, again, I think this topic, the nexus of this topic of social media and cell phones is going to be on a lot of folks' mind. What is your advice for parents as they are grappling with these new realities? How do you counsel parents as to what responsible cell phone and social media use looks like?
Based on your reading of your kid and whatever research is out there, what are your expectations around cell phone use and social media use? You have to have expectations. That's critical, right? You have to juxtapose those expectations around the hand you've been dealt, a kid, but I think having expectations is critical. You can't just leave this to the whims of the peer culture. You can't just leave this to the whims of your own child. If you have concerns about social media and cell phone use, you should have expectations very early on about those things in your kid's life, right? One thing I'll say about that 3-month-old across the aisle from me on the airplane, when she was standing up in her dad's lap, she wasn't looking out the window. She was looking at the screen in front of her. And I'm saying to myself, as we already know, right? There's a dopamine ping right there, right? There was it. They're going to have some work to do, but they're going to have expectations around what that means. So to his credit, I like some of the recommendations that Jonathan Haidt had in his book, The Anxious Generation. I thought it was interesting that all of his recommendations were unilateral and more adult-driven. I don't think that's going to fly. But a lot of his recommendations related to parental involvement as early as possible in the screen, social media, and phone lives of their children. Here's what's interesting. If you are watching a movie with your kid at 5 years old, as I did with my own, that's family togetherness time, right? And those are some of my kids still talk about. All the Seinfeld episodes that we watch together, right? We have them all memorized. We've seen like 37 times, right? That's family togetherness time. That counts, but there's a screen in front of us. So I think a lot of this, and we'll talk about this at the end, comes down to parents thinking about what they value. What do they value in terms of what they want for their kid, what they want for their family? What does that look like? And what are their expectations around that? And by the way, it is no different with academic performance. It is no different with chores, right? This is another thing parents need to have expectations around, built around their concerns about the dangers and potential harms of the things that are out there.
One last question before we break really quickly for more questions from the audience. You've already noted that kids are not a monolith, adults are not a monolith. There are no one-size-fits-all approaches. And another theme that comes out in your work is the vulnerable child and how we spot and then manage the concerns of more vulnerable children. In an era of social media, it strikes me that there might be some ways in which social media / cell phones are different than some of the other stressors that we've outlined. On social media, you are really only exposed to the top 5% of everyone's lives, not the often much less glamorous 95%. The other aspect of this that I think is different, which is social media, especially when it becomes an addiction, it's so common as to almost be normalized. Other types of addictive behaviors, deeply concerning, but still quite rare. Substance use, things of that nature. But all of us, are on our phones 5, 6, 7 hours a day, or in front of a screen, rather, 5, 6, 7 hours a day. And so it's difficult to figure out what the line is, let alone who is more vulnerable, such that additional restrictions may be applicable. How do you think about spotting more vulnerable kids in this era of social media?
Well, I guess there's two ways I would approach it. Number one, is my kid vulnerable in the first place, right? And those are kids who are not doing well in some aspect of their life, right? And roughly put, that would be a kid who's already anxious, a kid who's already having social difficulties, a kid who's already unhappy, a kid who is already prone to explosive outbursts or challenging behaviors in response to frustration. Neurodivergent kids have come a very long way in our society, but society is still not exactly built around the needs of kids who are neurodivergent, right? That's at the front end. Beyond that, you have to have expectations based on your kid, and then you are watching very closely for additional social withdrawal, whether your kid has an enormous amount of difficulty getting off. I was thinking about this. What defines excessive? Excessive use. It's totally individualized, right? There's what each of us would find okay as a parent. And once again, it comes back to us. What are our expectations around that based on this is what we do on everything, right? Based on my parents' expectations around TV watching. TV was limited, right? There's shows I wasn't allowed to watch. And then as time went on, they just decided, okay, he's fine now, so we'll let him go. He can watch whatever he wants, right? And yes, my friends and I did pick up the occasional Penthouse magazine to check out anatomy that we knew nothing about, right? And that, quite frankly, was one way in which we learned. It was titillating, another dopamine rush, right? So you get the idea.
Yep.
But you have to have expectations, and you have to notice when your kid's not meeting them, and you have to notice when your kid is not doing well. You have to do that anyways, and if you think that social media is a big part of why they're not doing well.
Got it.
That's late in the game.
Right.
Early in the game, you're thinking about who's vulnerable. Beyond that, you're watching very closely.
I'm going to hold off. Actually, Ross, I want to get through sort of the synthesis part, and then we're going to open it wide for questions. And the synthesis is really, so what? What do we do about this now? And I think the way that I want to tee this up, it builds off of the discussion you just outlined, which is, in effect, if the current world is still working for most kids, not all kids, but for most kids, what do we need to change in order to make it work for the most vulnerable kids, from a structural and policy perspective?
All right. I think adults in schools and at home are too obsessed with compliance. Compliance is a big deal to us. We want kids to do what they're told, right? I view non-compliance as information. If a kid is not complying with an adult directive, there's something getting in the way. For many, many years, including my childhood, what did you do with non-compliance? You squashed it.
Yes.
Because you were paying attention to the non-compliance. You were not paying attention to what the non-compliance was telling you. Kids who are doing well aren't very non-compliant. They're meeting most of our expectations: academic, behavioral, social. They're not that non-compliant. They are sort of out of harm's way when it comes to what our society does with non-compliance and other concerning behaviors that are simply telling us that a kid is struggling. In the same way that an infant's cry is telling us that an infant is distressed, non-compliance and other concerning behaviors tell us that this kid is struggling. Now, I would extend that to depression, anxiety. If a kid is struggling, and I think this benefits all kids, I think the ecosystem needs to be oriented around the kids who are struggling. I think everyone benefits when the ecosystem is oriented around the kids who are struggling. No one is harmed, because the definition of good education and good parenting is meeting kids where they're at. Also happens to be why we have special education law, because the goal is to meet kids where they're at. But if we're more oriented toward the kids who are struggling, I don't think the kids who are doing well lose anything, because even the kids who are doing well struggle sometimes. So the real question becomes, what do the kids who aren't doing well need most from us? Here we go. Do we have time? This is 2 minutes.
We got it.
We need to be less focused on their behavior. The behavior is just the frustration of the stress response, and more focused on the expectations they're having difficulty meeting that are causing those frustration responses. And instead of modifying the behavior, which is what we've been doing for decades, since B.F. Skinner, right? We've been focused on behavior. We haven't been focused on the problems that are causing those behaviors. So most of my work is oriented around helping adults be problem solvers, not behavior modifiers. The good news is the approach that I originated, called collaborative and proactive solutions, is evidence-based, and it improves behavior every bit as much as interventions that are completely focused on behavior, right? But in this model, you're improving behavior by solving the problems that are causing them. So now let me just go a little bit further. Kids who are vulnerable have what we call unsolved problems. If all we're focused on is their behavior, the problems will not get solved. Because what we do about behavior, reward it, punish it, those are not problem-solving strategies. Consequences don't solve problems. Who solves problems? We do. How do we solve those problems? I'm almost done.
It's all good.
As you would imagine, collaboratively, with the kid as a full participant in the process. Yes, even the non-speaking kids. Yes, even the kids who don't really want to talk to you. I find that they will talk to you. Once you stop talking with them about their concerning behavior, which just causes them to become defensive, think they're in trouble, and stop talking to you, they'll talk. And the problem solving should also be proactive. Now we've just landed on my obsession of the year. It troubles me greatly that a lot of what we teach educators to do with kids who are struggling teaches them what to do when it's already late. We're teaching people what to do once a kid becomes escalated. And that is an industry. Teaching adults, especially educators, what to do once a kid is becoming escalated is a huge industry with private equity investment, right? Apparently there's money in teaching people how to be late. The action's in what you do when it's early.
The prevention stage.
Correct.
Right.
And so that's the proactive piece. It is huge, and not just in families, but perhaps especially in schools, where we could go on forever about this. A lot of intervention is late.
It's too late in the game.
Correct. That's not good for the kids. That's not good for the educators. No, educators don't want to restrain and seclude kids. People get hurt. 79 kids have died over a 30-year span in the United States of America being restrained.
79.
79. They were suffocated. So my obsession these days is early. The earlier the better. Let's stop putting educators and kids in harm's way by teaching people what to do when it's already late. Let's focus on problems. Problems come way before the behavior. The behavior is just the frustration response. Let's focus on the problems. Let's start solving them. That's what's getting in the way for these kids anyways. And here's what's interesting. when we identify those problems with kids, the anxiety label doesn't matter quite as much anymore. The depression label doesn't really matter that much anymore. Oppositional defiant disorder doesn't matter that much anymore. Autism spectrum disorder doesn't matter that much anymore, because those labels weren't telling us what these individual kids were struggling with.
Which is the problems themselves.
Correct.
Not the diagnosis itself.
Correct.
I see.
So,
Very interesting.
a little digression.
No,
there, but
very, very helpful. Very, very helpful. Very illuminating to hear your method and see it applied to this broader context. Before we open it up, we can't leave a conversation about youth mental health without touching on COVID, the impact of COVID, and specifically school closures. There's two ways to look at this, given what we know now, and then, of course, given what we knew at the time. But let's talk about first the impact of COVID on youth mental health.
it made it worse.
Okay, yeah, no surprises there.
Yes. And things were trending in the wrong direction as it was. COVID accelerated children's mental health issues. COVID accelerated my mental health issues. I was talking with somebody at lunch today about what COVID did to me. It made me scared to be close to people. It made me head in the exact opposite direction if I was approaching somebody. That's not conducive to mental health. We were scared based on what we knew then. You can probably speak better to what we know now.
Well, we'll come back to that, perhaps. Let's touch on the important issue of school closures.
Yep.
We should not avoid that discussion.
Yeah.
I think it's important that we grapple with some of these decisions that were made across states, across state governments, at the local level as well. How do you, clearly, again, school closures not beneficial, not at all. There's no one who believes that. But what was the impact in your assessment? And then more importantly, what is needed to regain or recover some of what was lost?
I'm not that interested in recovering what was lost because, as you know, I think there was a rush back to normal, right? And I think the rush back to normal was oblivious to what people had been through. There's a good reason 600,000 educators have left the profession during and post-COVID, right? What we demanded of educators during the pandemic, not even close to being reasonable, right? What we demanded of kids, not even close to being reasonable. It was very scary. It made everything worse, and we thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we were putting physical health above mental health. We might make some decisions differently now, but the net effect was that things were trending in a bad direction, were accelerated during COVID. You had kids who lost loved ones, you had kids who were alone a good part of the day, you have kids who lost 2 to 3 years of socialization and learning. But believing that we can make up 2 or 3 years in a year is a good way to make things worse.
Very interesting. And as you and I have talked about, there is the broader policy question that has to balance the impact of school closures with the potential epidemiological, infectious disease impact, and we're still sorting out that, to be candid. So but these are all important lessons, and to be fair, I think we underestimated or undervalued the impact on children's mental health, and perhaps overweighted the infectious disease side of things. But again, that's all via the retrospectoscope, which is the easiest way to look at it.
Right.
Very, very difficult at the time.
And especially kids who really badly needed to be in school.
Yes.
They suffered the most.
They suffered the most, yes. We would love to hear from you all. So let's move toward questions. We've got ample time.
Nora's going to get called on.
Yep, and so we have one very eager questioner in the front. However, perhaps there are others. It appears that there is not. So, Dr. Mills, let me turn to you.
Thank you. And Ross, it's great to see you. And of course, I love having Nirav back in Maine, as I'm sure everybody does. So thank you. And Ross, I've heard you a number of times over the years, and I've always appreciated your approach. I know you consulted in one of my kids' schools, and it made a big difference in my child and many children's lives there. I agree, there's a but coming, as you can probably tell, but I do very much appreciate your attention to the ecosystem, and I think you're absolutely right. We do have to look at the family, the school, the community ecosystem in its entirety. I have been impressed by Jonathan Haidt's. I'm going back to the cell phone discussion, but I have been impressed by his the studies that he cites about the effects of cell phones and social media. And I agree with you. It's not the end all. It's not just getting rid of cell phones or smartphones, I should say, in kids' lives isn't going to solve everything. But I do push back a bit on your emphasis on this being a mandate. I mean, I think about we're
On the
here-
what? I didn't hear that part.
On it being a mandate.
On the mandate, because
Oh, got it.
Yep.
I feel like what we're trying to do is look at the ecosystem by creating a healthy place. So, for instance, taking the schools, a healthy place for kids to attend school. This school has a policy, as all schools do, of being smoke-free. They weren't. When I was in high school in Farmington, Maine, they were not smoke-free. They are smoke-free. We could call it a mandate, but we're simply creating a healthy atmosphere. We also don't, unfortunately for you, we don't have Cocoa Puffs at the cafeteria as much as all kids want. So
Not all change is good.
So I think of with the evidence building, again, I agree it's not the panacea, but I just feel like with some of the evidence building around smartphones, it's these things, not the flip phones. And Haidt makes a big case, I think, about the fact that they're very addictive. I mean, gee, here I am holding mine, and as if I can't put it down. But it's there's a lot of. He makes a case that the algorithms that are used are highly addictive, and if you have a mature brain, you can kind of get away from it. I mean, I'm addicted somewhat, but not as much as I know a lot of children are whom I see. So I just would push back on, I just feel like it is something, again, I wouldn't want people to think, oh, we ban cell phones and smartphones in schools and suddenly the kids are going to be okay. But it just feels like it's something. It's just like smoke-free policies.
Yep.
It's something.
How about that, Russ? It's at least a step.
Truth is, I would have no problem if there were no cell phones in schools. The big question is not the goal, how you're going about achieving it. That's all. And my preference, just based on history and experience, is that when we do things to kids, they are less successful than when we do things with them. So I don't disagree with anything you've said about the potential impact of cell phones in schools and the need to do something about it. There's no downside in involving kids in the solution. That's the difference between mandating, being unilateral, and being collaborative. My experience is that solutions that are arrived at collaboratively tend to be a whole lot more successful. It's easy to mandate. That doesn't mean that it's going to be successful.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Mills. Open it up to others. One note with respect to questions, as we have veered into personal topics, issues of parenting, I appreciate the inclination to ask questions about perhaps your child or your family situation. Because of the highly fact-specific nature of those questions and the inquiry they require, Dr. Green's not able to weigh in on anything about your particular child. He is, however, willing to hang out here afterward. And so if you have questions that are more fact-specific or child-specific or dog-specific, you are welcome to hang out with him afterwards. But for now, we'll keep the topic the aperture a bit more broad. So other questions? Yes, please. Yes, sir.
Dog specific, have you considered a pet psychologist?
We're working on it, yeah.
But no, seriously, is there any learning on mentorship, peer-to-peer mentorship or peer-to-peer learning in the schools to help become part of the solution on some of the anxiety, perhaps depression, in meeting kids where they are with a mentor or a buddy, for lack of a better term?
Great question. I don't know that I'm familiar with programs in which peers are helping each other with anxiety and depression, though I'm sure that exists. There is peer-to-peer conflict resolution. So peers are involved in each other's quote-unquote mental health in schools. I'm just not as familiar with the degree to which that model has been used on issues like anxiety and depression.
Ross, an interesting component of the Minnesota cell phone in school example that you mentioned was that in addition to involving the students in it, they also involved the students as mentors
Yes.
to help other students witness the impact of phone addiction and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And so both of these strategies seem like they're in sync with one another.
Yep.
So, yep. Other questions?
Way in the back.
Oh, way in the back. Yes, please. And then we'll come down here.
Thank you, Nina. Is it on? Oh, my name is Phoebe Williamson. I'm a junior here at Freeport High School, and I totally agree with you, Dr. Green, that having students involved in the decision about phone policies or really just policy in general, but especially pertaining to mental health, is going to be really helpful. And my response to that question has always been, teaching kids how to have skills to manage phone use is going to be a lot more important than just taking them away, because I think it's pretty clear by now that this technology and the phones and the AI and everything is not going away. So high school is probably the last time these blanket phone bans are going to be the case. And so instead of just locking them up at the beginning of the day, teaching students how do we use it as a tool and not a toy, and how do we use it for good, and how do we use it, learn how to manage it and manage anything that can be unhealthy or addictive, I think is really helpful. And I'm wondering if you have any more insight about how to get students involved in those decisions and on board with that kind of change.
Great.
Thank you for that question and for your thoughts. The main piece of advice there is just do it. We often don't think to ask the kid. So schools do this in different ways. You can inquire with students who wants to be a part of the solution and go with those kids and get their thoughts. They're going to tell you about the harms of social media. They're going to tell you about the harms of having cell phones in schools. And they're probably going to come up with better ideas than we would about how we can solve those problems. There's different views on the degree to which, and Jonathan Haidt does have a view on this, he thinks partial bans don't work. What I care about is what works for this school with the involvement of these students based on this ecosystem. Schools are not a monolith. Kids are not a monolith. This is a problem that schools need to tackle, and I just don't think mandating is the smart play.
Very good.
You know what? This generation of kids is smart. They are intuitive. They got ideas. There's absolutely no reason not to hear from them on this issue.
Very helpful. Thank you for that question. There was a question. Yes, sir, right there.
Thank you very much. In the concept of anxiety as a childhood has been, I guess, increasing. You have an opinion that the children are, for the most part, okay. But the children are, in this day and age, for the most part, okay. Surprisingly well off, considering their what they've gone through. What about the parents? I mean, the ecosystem that children live in is, even with social media and television, and don't forget television, and just the internet, skip social media, the exposure to the world of the internet, which is its own, we haven't even talked about that. Parents have gone through the last 25 years and are incredibly, to my mind, more stressed, more anxious, more concerned. How does that affect the children? And how much of this is driven by that kind of problem or those changes, as opposed to just what children themselves have been exposed to?
Yep, great question. And I think it's hard to tease that out perfectly in terms of what's the effect of an anxious parent or a depressed parent on kids. We do have research on that. It is still individualized, but it certainly increases risk for adverse outcomes in that kid. We can say that definitively. We just can't be definitive in individual cases about how it's playing out in this particular family. If you're asking about adult mental health, most adults are doing reasonably well, but their rates of anxiety and depression have been trending in the wrong direction as well and got a lot worse during COVID. And by the way, I'd say the same thing about educators. The other people our kids spend a great deal of time hanging out with.
Very good, thank you. Other questions? If not, there's one back, so we're going to go back over to that side of the room. The gentleman in front.
You've mentioned that you think in general kids are okay, but I keep on reading about how damaged boys are. Do you believe that a lot of the studies are coming out as correlation or causation? I get some points for using that, right? And then the second thing is the impact of pornography on relationships between boys and girls. I was reading something in the New York Times that just baffled me in terms of how that is impacting the relationships. So can you comment on those two things?
Well, one thing I will say is that while I appreciate the gravity of the issue, the New York Times did get you to click on that story. That's significant. You clicked. That was their goal. Now, were there things in that story that were very important? Yes. Are most of the data on that correlational? Yes. Is it good for boys to be watching porn, 75% of them by the age of 12? Wouldn't be my preference. Is it good for them to be exposed to a lot of violent porn? No. I'm not familiar with data telling us what the impact of that is on future relationships, so I can't answer that question.
And what about the former point? The gentleman raises the point about are boys in crisis? And I want to broaden that just a bit. I want to broaden the ambit there a bit, because there's an interesting gender dynamic here, and I want you to comment on the ways in which what we've talked about may differ or perhaps even break down along gender lines. One strain of thought is what the gentleman notes, which is boys and men are in crisis. There's a lot of discussion about the manosphere and the way in which young, vulnerable boys are being drawn toward toxic masculinity through podcasts, so on and so forth. Likewise, for young girls, the effects of social media may be particularly pronounced and pernicious, given the bullying that may occur. How should we think about these things through the lens of gender? Do the recommendations differ, things like that?
I don't know if the recommendations differ. You still are having expectations, whether it's a male or female. Whatever the social media thing that they're doing is, there's some chance that it's going to be bad for them, right? Boys are more oriented toward porn and gaming. Girls, especially those who, as I've read, are less secure. In that Minnesota piece on NPR, one of the girls said that social media, if you're going to be on social media, you better be secure. Because
you're only seeing the top 5%.
Seeing the top 5% in terms of what bodies are supposed to look like, faces are supposed to look like, hair is supposed to look like. That leaves 95% wanting, right? So what could be causing harm is different for boys versus girls. Since my friend Michael Thompson published his book about boys 20, 30 years ago, I've been hearing that boys are in crisis. Some boys are in crisis. Most boys are not in crisis. Have roles changed for males? Yes. Can that take a little getting used to? Yeah. Is that going to cause some things in social media to popularize a return to the good old days of male stereotypical roles? Yeah, we live in a capitalistic society. If there's a need for it, people are going to fill that need, right? So it's a very interesting bi-directional question. Is social media causing it, or are men seeking it out because just it's a little bit harder to be a male these days than it was 30 to 40 years ago?
We're going to go right there. I'm getting signals to call on someone right there in the middle. We got this may be our last question, I believe. One more after this. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you both for being here. It's fascinating. You brought up the thought earlier that there are many theories behind what causes autism. If we can put the vaccine thing aside for a minute.
Please.
Well, we can't really put that aside now, but keep going.
Okay, I got it, yeah. But I'd love to hear from you what some of those theories are. And are there more kids on the spectrum now than there were? Or are we just labeling more kids on the spectrum? What's going on with all that? Can you answer anything around that?
I wish I could give you something definitive. More kids are being diagnosed with autism. That's definitive. What's the cause of that? RFK has his own notions about that. I'll have to answer honestly. I don't pay that much attention to theories about cause. I'm not paying that much attention to diagnoses. They're labels that describe something. I've always felt that there were multiple pathways. There's multiple pathways to ADHD. There's multiple pathways to autism. What we've learned is that our prior thinking about causes of autism were way off base. I don't care that much about cause. I care a lot about what's sitting in front of me, because that's what I can do something about. I can't do anything about cause. I don't pay a whole lot of attention to the cause literature, given number one, that I can't do anything about it, and given number two, it's imprecision.
Very good. Last question for the evening. Yes, right down here. Yep. We got one coming your way.
Sorry, I wrote it down because I just wanted to make sure I didn't fumble it too bad. So, considering that many students identify risk of gun violence in schools as a source of stress.
Can you ask very slowly?
Yeah.
I don't know if you...
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Yeah, please.
Considering that many students identify risk of gun violence in school as a source of stress, how much responsibility do we have as a community to implement existing evidence-based, effective gun violence prevention programs in schools, like the ones from, for example, nonprofit Sandy Hook Promise? Because I've found that in our schools and communities seem to be invested in programs to support and improve mental health, which obviously are essential and so important, but maybe less so in implementing programs to reduce the risk of gun violence. And that sort of strikes me as what you might have been mentioning a little bit before, sort of dealing with the outcome or the behavior and not the problem.
Yep.
Thank you.
Do I think we should be doing everything possible, including implementations of programs like what Sandy Hook puts out, Sandy Hook Promise? Absolutely. And it should be a very high priority. I got to tell you, one of my greatest disappointments as an American human being right now is how many shootings there have been since Columbine, how many mass shootings. You know, us Mainers, I like to call myself a Mainer. I haven't been here long enough to be a Mainer, but long enough for me to think I'm a Mainer. We're accustomed to thinking it can't happen here. Lewiston proved us wrong. It is to my tremendous disappointment that we have not been able to muster the political will to solve this problem. And what that is telling our kids about the value we're placing on their lives and the lack of credibility we have because we haven't been able to do anything about that. To me, that is an absolute tragedy. That's the most provocative thing I'll say all night.
It's hard to disagree. I mean, yep. It was Sandy Hook, which affected primarily youngsters, elementary kids, that we decided as a nation that we were okay with young kids dying, and that we weren't going to do anything about that. And then everything since then.
I
So,
actually
with that,
promised one
the
more.
last question goes to Tom.
No, but
Yeah.
no, I promised to give up my last question tonight to Dr. Seeger. Mark Seeger had a question and didn't have a chance, so please.
Oh, very good.
So I'm going to defer to him tonight.
Okay, last question for the evening. Yes, sir.
Growing up, our family's German Shepherd was Blitz. In the post-war group, my question, comment masquerading as a question, is about the younger children that we haven't talked much about today. The children before school age. One of the most wonderful things that's happened, you talked about social change. The movement of women into traditionally male domains of work has been the most spectacular and positive phenomena in my working life. The shadow side of that is that the movement of men into traditionally female domains of work has nowhere near begun to match that. And I worry about the cost of that disequilibrium on kids. This year, our state senator shepherded through a parenting leave piece of legislation, which I believe is now law, and it's a step in the right direction, but there is so much more to do to make sure that in the earliest years of learning, attention is paid to developing habits of mind and habits of heart that will lead to healthy and fulfilling lives for all children.
Yes.
I love your comment. If it's good for kids, I'm all for it. I just think we need to be thinking more about what's good for kids.
Very good.
Thank you, Dr. Ross Green and Dr. Nirav Shah. I am honored to have you both be friends. Thank you. Thank you very much tonight.
Well done, Ross. That was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. Thank you for doing that.